Good morning, Sue. Can't see you, but maybe you can hear.
Hi, Neil.
Hi, Debbie. Debbie, was there ever any announcement made of the program we're having on Sunday that Rabbi Bichon is one of the panelists in?
Hello. Shabbat Shalom. Yes, it's sort of, it's Shushan Purim, I suppose. So,
I'm still leaving temple, so I've got you on my phone.
oh, excellent. Yeah, I like your Hamantashen. I don't know. I think I have some.
Was a nice service this morning.
Oh, good.
Nice turnout. Thinking that your video helped. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh, you mean for the family service? Yes, it
The
was.
family
Definitely.
service, yeah.
Yeah, it was nice. Had a good time. Those kids are really into it when you give them a chance. And
Debbie, were you there when I asked if the notice was made of the program that Rabbi Bichon's going to be in tomorrow afternoon? I guess not.
I wasn't there. She might be in transition. She said she was on the phone.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Neil. What'd you say?
Did anybody announce the program tomorrow where Rabbi Bichon's going to be one of the panelists at 4 o'clock?
At 4 o'clock?
Commission?
For which organization?
Well, it's a program of the Jewish Muslim group.
Are you a panelist tomorrow, Rabbi?
Yeah, we got 4 people talking about religion in the time of COVID. And
I'm not sure if anybody told me about it. Neil, if you send me an email, I'll try to get something out tomorrow morning.
that's a bit I'll send you one.
It's a little late, but you never send it to me because I'm interested also. Rabbi didn't tell me.
But Rabbi Bichon and Rabbi Till will talk from the Jewish perspective. Then we have the Imam of the Islamic Center.
When is this?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, it's a program on how we are coping with COVID in our respective faith groups.
And it's
What time tomorrow?
4
4
p.m.
o'clock tomorrow afternoon.
Okay,
It's
because Elliot Fix, I don't know if you know him, but he's.
Yeah, his thing is from 2 to 3.
And I'm getting a shot in the morning, so I hope I'll be in good shape. Second,
Oh, the second one.
yeah.
Oh, excuse me. I know everybody's different, but my impression is that the symptoms, if they're going to come like 12 to 24 hours after the second shot. So you should be fine for these programs.
Good, because I also have some writing I have to do for work tomorrow. So anyway, happy Purim, everybody, or post Purim, or Shushan Purim.
Right.
I had my second shot yesterday.
Oh, how are you feeling?
Except for just a twinge of an ache where the needle went in, fine.
Great.
That's good.
Good.
That's good. May you all be well, and may I hope it really helps the country. I am going to get our class started in a moment. I need to change something before I share. I want to begin though by just sort of seeing if there are big questions or concerns coming out of last time in terms of anti-Semitism and the left and the right. There's no good answer, but if there, as long as we kind of helped to define the problem and extend it, then we probably did our job last week. So let me see if, okay. That's big for you now? Yes? Good, okay. All right, so we are, and I've already in many ways addressed the lingering stuff from last week. Similar to last week, I want to make sure we have some definitions in mind. So we'll go over what we mean by dual loyalty and identity politics. And then we'll get into each with sources, and then this question of alignment for today. I will tell you that the dual loyalty alignment was clear. So I'm going to present that as like something that did work. So I don't have a question mark next to it, whereas I do have a question mark next to alignment under identity politics because not clear, right? And then there's sort of less to recommend for follow-up. And I'll leave you with this question, which is, it's really not about Judaism, it's about America. And that will be, again, the sort of like dual loyalty. There may have been a solution that did work. Can it still work? And the same thing for identity politics. Can it still work? With the assumption being that the challenge is about America and not necessarily about Judaism. So let's see what we're talking about. And this is, by the way, concludes the sort of challenges to Jewish peoplehood. So we're really continuing the anti-Semitism question, a piece of which is going to be, understanding a form of Jewish nationalism and Zionism as a form of nationalism. We're not dealing as much specifically with Menschlich nationalism, so much as like, what does it mean for there to be a Jewish state and for that to be either an alternate home for the Jews, or meaning America and Israel, or what does it mean for us to be dealing with anti-Semitism around the world, like as a global issue, or specifically in the United States, and how does that affect the place of Israel or on its own, and the place of Israel in American Jewish identity. Next time we will look at different models for peoplehood that might help us to kind of sort through some of these issues. And then finally wrap up with this notion of what it means to be at home as a Jew. And again, that may not resolve some of the issues we're talking about now in terms of our divided communities or our multiple homes, but maybe. I'm hopeful, I'll be honest. I have a sense that by doing this, we're actually trying to create something. So let's get into it and see if you agree. Dual loyalty. If you end up watching the video for the unit on dual loyalty, Yehuda Kurtzer reminds us, and it's important to remember this, that dual loyalty is a specific accusation. That like everybody knows we all have multiple loyalties. We're loyal to ourselves or to our family or to our community or to people who are like us in geography and race and religion. Like the whole, like most of humanity would agree that you have multiple loyalties, and you should, that's normal, right? But to say someone has dual loyalty is to kind of create a false dichotomy in which you are not allowed to have all those multiple identities or multiple loyalties. You only have two. One is presumably a part of the society in which you live, but it's also allegiance to another, and that's the dual piece. So what I took from him and kind of articulated for our purposes today is that dual loyalty is an insidious denial of multiple loyalties or allegiances that elevates one aspect of somebody else's loyalty. You never say this about yourself. You always say it about somebody else. It's elevating one aspect of their identity to be a contradiction of what you share with them, right? So, if I went out of my way to say like, oh, you New Yorkers, you know nothing about what it means to be Jewish, then like, we're both Jewish, but like, just because you're in Rochester, I'm in Delaware, it doesn't mean that like that Jewish connection should be denied in any way. But if I make that accusation, right, I am elevating the fact that you're in Rochester, even if you didn't grow up there, right? Like, or even if you're not originally from New York, and I'm not from Delaware originally, so like, it's a falsehood to begin with. But if I make that right into everything, then again, it's this like insidious attempt to caricature you as different from me, and therefore dangerous to what we share. And so, we've seen some examples in prior weeks, but I'll just review those quickly and add a couple. And then the question is, what do we do about it? We're also going to deal with identity politics, which is sort of like the more contemporary version of dual loyalty. So Michal Biton is the Hartman scholar who gives a lecture in the second of the two units we're covering today. I'm going to cover everything she said and pretty much everything that Yehuda Kurtzer says. So I don't think you need to watch their videos, but I'll say more about what's left that's really perhaps intriguing. So she defines identity politics. This is her working definition, which is why I gave her credit. She says it's a group-based political identity. So again, group-based and it's political. So this isn't just like religious. This isn't racial. This isn't geographic or sort of place of origin. It's not national. It's political. Okay, and she says it's most often rooted in racial or ethnic or sexual or religious or cultural or even gender identity. Right. So again, very contemporary conversation. The degree to which those groups, your identity within them becomes a political identity, right? And it's an unapologetic affirmation of one's heritage. So it's not just like, oh yeah, I am a guy, I'm all for men, like, or heterosexuality, like, yeah, straightness all the way. It's not like that. It's like, I'm going to actually politicize my position, right? Which typically means against the other versions, okay, but not always. Sometimes it's just in concert. So particularly with ethnicity, I'll say, right? You'll have Latinos and African Americans and Asians, like as people of color, right? As a kind of sort of like broad political alliance, right? But it's because each of them is expressing their own identity politics, and there are areas where they come together. And we'll get into that intersectionality and the fanciness of that, but like, right, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm Asian American, so I don't care about anybody who's a different kind of hyphenation or ethnicity. It's really, right, it just, I'm going to express that and bring that to the front of what I do in politics. And there'll be nuance for that. Questions about these two sort of working definitions? Again, the key is dual loyalty is dangerous. It's like, it's not real. It's an accusation, and identity politics is a political. It's not just the identity or loyalty piece.
Loyalty is a kind of label that you're saying that you put on somebody you're trying to put down, you don't like.
Correct. So
you're a communist, you're a dual loyalist, you know,
exactly,
it's another label.
Right? So it's a particular kind of name calling, right? And yes, exactly. McCarthyism was a kind of accusation of dual loyalty, right? And it was insidious. It was like danger, you know, it was like meant to really put communists or people who just thought that communism was interesting, forget about like supporting it or doing anything for the American communist movement, right? And much the same thing could be said today in terms of the way certain parts of the right are calling people globalists, right? So if you're a globalist, then I mean, yes, you recognize market reality, but the accusation is actually that you care more about being a member of like the globe than about being American, and that's not necessarily true. So again, it's like a negative connotation. It's a hate kind of name tag. All right. So let's look at dual loyalty. I said some of these are going to be familiar, so I'm going to go quickly. Pharaoh, we saw this last week, not only says that the Jews are becoming too numerous, but that if, I don't know if I can annotate this, if in the event of war, the accusation is we would join with the enemies of Pharaoh, which was probably true, but he said it out loud, and the Torah records that, like, that particular conversation, right? And that's the first sort of known accusation of dual loyalty against the Jews, or against particularly Jews in a diaspora, right? The next is,
We know why he thought that, because at least in the story, as I remember in the Bible, you know, up to that point, everyone's getting along.
So interesting. I will tell you that I'm glad you asked, because it's sort of one of those pet interests of mine. There are sort of two theories. One, there's a lot of support for, which is that, like, if you actually try to get into some of the historical period in which it's likely that the Exodus took place, this Pharaoh was from the pharaohs of the south, like at the, I mean, it's hard to think of geographically, but the top of the Nile, in more like in Thebes, than in the Delta. And there was a period of Egyptian history when the Hyksos Egyptians, so like one group of Egyptians, were the pharaohs, and they predominantly were in northern Egypt along the Nile Delta, and like not all the way to Thebes. And they would have been more welcoming to the Semites, to Joseph and his brothers. All of that sort of sequence would have made sense under the Hyksos. It's just like their political style and philosophy and some of the ancient Near Eastern kind of archaeological pieces that either show up in Genesis at the end and in that part of Egyptian history match. Okay. But the Hyksos got kicked out by the pharaohs of like the Egypt that we think of when we think of Egypt. So this pharaoh, who would have been like, you know, a couple pharaohs after the change when the southern pharaonic pharaohs took back control of all of Egypt, they would still be worried about the Hyksos, and they would be worried that, again, the Jews who had been kind of friendly under the Hyksos would side with like this sort of group that had gotten expelled but might have come back. I feel like Preston Child has a lot of novels of this period. So like, you know, if you just want to read historical fiction, find something with the Hyksos, and you'll see this tension between two kinds of Egyptian rulers and their kingdoms. And so that's one piece, is that actually there would be enemies, not like totally foreign, but like very Egyptian, very much present in the minds of this pharaoh. And the other is that like, it's possible, this is a little bit more of a stretch, that the whole Exodus story is really two oral traditions being brought together that are hundreds of years apart. So this pharaoh who didn't know Joseph is really from a completely different kind of storyline, and might have been part of, you know, an ancient Near Eastern setting where life was more challenging. And that could be, just for the sake of argument, like 100 years different than the Hyksos to the other pharaohs. I think the first one's easier to explain, and it's just, you know, but it creates other problems for when the Exodus took place and where Sinai is and all that kind of stuff. But it would make sense for this to be on the minds of this pharaoh. Right, and then again, the question becomes Pitom and Ramses, like, is that going back to a different storyline? Because Ramses II, who we usually say is this pharaoh, time-wise doesn't match up as well with what I was just telling you in terms of the Hyksos. It would have been, I can't remember the name of the pharaoh, so sorry. I'll have it for Passover. Other questions on this piece? Because the next one is Purim. We just read this. And I have to tell you, I was teaching 5th through 7th graders, and one of them asked me a question today, like, why did Haman hate the Jews? And I said, well, I have it here. I'm going to show the grown-ups later. And so I said, like, so first at the top, right, Mordecai wouldn't bow. And so Haman took it personally, and he had his own issues. But also, and we saw this last week, the Jews lived throughout this Persian Empire, right? And in all these different places, it didn't matter whether we were in Egypt, in Israel, in Iran, or in Turkey, like, which all had different names back then. We didn't like fully mix in with the populations there. We kept our own rules, and we mixed in a little bit, but to Haman's view, we only did our own thing. We did not obey the laws of the king, even though, like we saw from Jeremiah, right, that we're enjoined while abroad or in exile to, you know, look after the safety and prosperity of the place we live. So he accuses us of a dual loyalty by kind of telling a half-truth, right, that we do keep our own law, but he uses that to say, like, and therefore we don't, right, have loyalty to Achashverosh. So the Purim story, alive and well. Good? All right, so we're going to jump forward in history. Because between the time of Achashverosh, even through Roman history, right, and the rabbis and the time of Jesus, and then the Roman emperors, including Constantine, who became Christian, and then the sort of like all of that time period, so I'm just going to say from like the year 0 till like 1800, when America has already kind of started and the French Revolution has happened, and now we're getting a little bit later, Napoleon is going to do something very different to what it means to be a Jew in exile. So again, in that intervening period, there was always somebody else in charge of us. We were always guests in our own homes. There were times when we were thrown out of a town. There were times when we were given full permission to live peacefully. And sometimes we would be accused of something and there would be some sort of persecution, but we were allowed to live or stay. And it really depended on the relationship between the local population, the lord of the land, at whatever level, right? And any of the other sort of geopolitical issues going on, like the Crusades or the plague, right? But when we move far forward into history, past some of the Enlightenment, an interesting thing happens where Napoleon, as he marches across Europe, decides to bring liberté, égalité, fraternité to the world. And he really means it. But that doesn't mean he's dumb, all right? So he says, Jews of France, do you want to be Frenchmen? And the Jews have to respond. So this is a fascinating sequence. We'll go through it, carefully, but not spending too much time on it. He sent commissioners to speak with the Sanhedrin, a group of Jewish notables, okay? And it says here, to the Assembly of Jewish Notables in 1806. And he says, or he has them say to the Jews, the wish of His Majesty is that you should be Frenchmen. It remains with you to accept the proffered title without forgetting that. To prove unworthy of it would be renouncing it altogether. So it's like it's an all or none. It's like you're going to be a Frenchman or things are going to be bad. And he says, as to our most ardent wish is to be able to report to the emperor that individuals, and this is a key phrase, of the Jewish persuasion can reckon as many faithful subjects determined, to conform in everything to the laws and to the morality which ought to regulate the conduct of all Frenchmen. So again, the question is, are you going to accept the laws of France and the morals, by which Frenchmen live? And we're calling you individuals of the Jewish persuasion. So how do they test that? Here's some example questions, right? Is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid when not pronounced by courts of justice and by virtue of laws in contradiction with the French code? So not for nothing, France was Catholic. They didn't like divorce. So this is a test of like, are you going to do your thing or are you going to do our thing? And for that matter, can we intermarry? Are the Jews only going to marry Jews? Can a Jewess marry a Christian or a Jew a Christian woman? Or has law ordered that Jews should only intermarry among themselves? And then the sort of key question, I didn't highlight it, but it's the key question. In the eyes of the Jews, are Frenchmen considered brethren or strangers? Right, and that goes back to our text from Leviticus, where it was like, we start with our brethren, then our people or kinspeople, right? And then what about our neighbors? And then, right, foreigners who live among us, strangers. We Jewishly are commanded to love them all, right? But there are sort of circles of concentration, and so they're teasing out this piece, right? So a key question is, do the Jews born in France, treated by law as French citizens, consider France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and to follow the directions of the civil code? So if we grant you citizenship, which is, again, liberté, égalité, fraternité, this is like Napoleon's thing he wants to do as an extension of the French Revolution and his empire. Grant citizenship, right? But what it means to be a citizen is to be a countryman and willing to fight in the army and obey the laws and follow directions. So by contrast, what about police jurisdiction, judicial power? How are rabbis elected, and do they police themselves? Or is it only sort of a custom thing and not a legal thing? Anything that Jews can't do in terms of profession. And oh, by the way, we understand from Jewish law that you don't charge interest to each other. Like, are you going to charge Napoleon interest, or are you going to, treat him like a brother? It's very smart, like well-read kind of, right? So let's see how they respond. You ready? Okay. So here's the response by the Jews, and I think actually I just want you to know it's 2 pages, okay? So, or 2 slides. So they changed the language. Instead of being Frenchmen of Jewish persuasion, right? They say, in the name of all Frenchmen professing the religion of Moses. Okay, so this is our first moment of, we are going to be French outside and Jewish inside. Now, I will say, in this time period, what it meant to be Catholic was also outside. So like, it's not a complete inner outer kind of religion, is only a self thing. But this is the beginning of that sort of like way of threading this needle and saying, I'm one person, and I'm French out, in the world, and I am Jewish in my private space. So that's sort of how they start this, and they start off. I'm just going to go down here to that. In consequence of this principle, the Jews have at all times considered it their duty to obey the laws of the state, and that since the revolution, they, like all Frenchmen, have acknowledged no others. So like, again, we're going to be good citizens. Like, that's not the issue. So let's address the other questions. Again, there are ellipses here because what's key is what's going to be stated here. Frenchmen are brethren, not strangers. So this is not v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. This is, or like, remember you were a stranger in Egypt, right? These are my achim, these are my brothers. And to help make the point, the Jewish religion has whose fundamental maxims are such: a religion which makes a duty of loving the stranger, which enforces the practice of social virtues, must surely require that its followers should consider their fellow citizens as brethren. So like, again, I just said v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. So if your neighbor is like yourself, right? So then you're not a stranger. And even if you were strange to me, like a kind of foreigner in some way, right? If you're a citizen, you're my brother. So they interpret that text, they present that text as a proof of loyalty, okay? And how could they consider themselves otherwise when they inhabit the same land, blah, blah, blah. And at the end, here in italics, yes, France is our country, all Frenchmen are our brethren, and this glorious title, by raising us in our own esteem, becomes a sure pledge that we shall never cease to be worthy of it. They want to be citizens, okay? And more. Do Jews born in and treated by the laws as French citizens consider France their country? Are they bound to defend it, bound to obey the laws and conform to the civil code? The answer, first of all, is that we've been here for a long time. So not only did we adopt this country and resided in it many generations, and did so under abridged civil rights, like we didn't have full citizenship. We were attached to France so much so that we preferred being debarred from certain areas rather than to leave. We can't do anything other than consider ourselves Frenchmen in France, and equally sacred and honorable, the bounden duty of defending our country, right? So like, it's little wonder that oh my goodness, I'm blanking for the moment. that we would get to the Dreyfus affair, right? That Dreyfus would be a captain in the French army. Like, that should not be surprising at all, because the Jews, even when they didn't have full rights, right, were going to be doing what they could for France. And then I love this, right? The Jews of France in 1806, they quote the text that we studied just 2 weeks ago. Jeremiah chapter 29. Jews have to consider Babylon as their country, right? Jeremiah exhorted us to till the ground, build houses, sow, and to plant, right? And then even more so, like in this we didn't study, when Ezra says that Cyrus the Great of Persia, so when Babylonia turned into Persia, Cyrus the Great says, "Oh, you can go home." Who leaves Babylonia? Who? Just the poor people. Don't worry, Napoleon. All the wealthy Jews, we're going to stay put. We like it here. You can have our money, our taxes, because like the wealthy Jews are going nowhere. Because even when we were given the opportunity to go back to Zion, back to Israel, back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, who went? I forget, what's the number here? 42,000, right? Who, by the way, were poor. Interesting commentary there. I'll let it just, I think I said enough. Okay, so what is, and then how do you prove the point, right? You say, this whole love of country is so strong that a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers. Even, I mean, it says, although he may be among the Jews. So I'm French. I go from Paris to London. I'm hanging out with my Jews, or with the Jews of London at synagogue on Shabbat. They're strangers to me because they're not French, right? And the same thing would be true, by the way, if an English Jew left London, came to Paris, he would be like, I don't know, you French Jews, like, you're French. We're not, my English identity comes first, right? There's no dual loyalty, there's one loyalty. Got it? Any questions? And to put a fine point upon it, right, again, the Jews died in the French army to express our citizenship, right? So what happens later in history? Later in history, like 100 years later, right, Louis Brandeis recognizes Zionism as a question of dual loyalty, because, in fact, right, particularly Jews in the Reform movement were feeling like Zionism and political Zion, Herzl and the Zionist World Zionist Congress, like this whole talk of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Okay, but like, we're happy here. We're Jewish here. We don't need it, right? And the only thing it's going to do is raise the specter of dual loyalty. So, and I think we studied that, way back in the first week. I forget the member of the CCAR who said something to that effect, right? But what Brandeis does in picking up Zionism is to say, there's no such thing as dual loyalty, right? And if you are talking about dual loyalty, you have it all wrong, because everybody has multiple loyalties and allegiances. So the first paragraph is about that multiple sort of like perspective, right? That we like what it means to be human is to have all those things. And the second two paragraphs, the second and third paragraph, are going to get to this. So what does he really think? And he starts to say it in the first paragraph too, but like he kind of refines it. So let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism. He wants to say that these things are synonymous, at least initially, right? Like Zionism and patriotism, meaning American patriotism, go hand in hand, they're parallel. Multiple loyalties are objectionable only when they are inconsistent, right? So he thinks American patriotism and Zionism are consistent. And because they're consistent, there's no issue here. and he goes on to say, a man is a better citizen of the United States for being a loyal citizen of his home, of his state, of his city, for being loyal to his family, to his profession or trade, for being loyal to his college or his lodge, right? You know, he's risen up in the world. So he knows, right? Like, the waspy thing to do is to be like all about your home state and your city. If you come from one, of course you're loyal to your family and your profession, right? It's a big deal to be a lawyer or a doctor or a banker, right? And that's assumed, right? Loyal to your college, right? So who went to Harvard and to Yale and to Cornell, right? And his lodge, right? So again, all these sort of like Knights of Columbus and Elk Lodges and Masons and like, or Freemasons, like all these sort of civic the Rotary Club, all these civic organizations like that were a big part of early 20th century or America, like that taught us to be loyal to a group. And that kind of loyalty makes us better citizens. He doesn't say all of why, but like, you know, it's training ground for being an American. So he gives the example that Irish Americans who contributed toward advancing home rule, right? Each of them was a better man and a better American for the sacrifice that they made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, but you can be Zionist without making Aliyah. Will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so, right? America was founded on this concept of bringing your faction, your identity, your particular loyalties into conversation with somebody who is doing the same thing from their perspective. And right, somehow that came into two parties always, instead of some sort of like more widely spread parliament. And the balance of those powers and the balance of that conversation is what helped the House of Representatives or Congress or the executive, judicial, and legal branch each work in concert. Like, it was about balancing this. Madison wanted this, right? This is Madisonian democracy. So again, training ground in your local loyalties, even if they take you and your attention to Ireland and to Palestine, you know, it doesn't mean you're moving back or moving there or anywhere. It just means you have an interest in where you came from. Right? And he says, because Americans' fundamental law seeks to make the real brotherhood of man. It wants us to be the melting pot, right? Like, we bring our individual identities, we come together, and this all works together. Jews have been teaching that for 2,500 years. And America's insistent demand in the 20th century is for social justice. That also has been the Jews striving for ages. So two things are going on here. Okay, two things are going on. One is, what does it mean, right, to just kind of come together as a patriot? And the other is the pursuit of social justice. So Brandeis is part of this sort of like, again, sense in which America is bringing equality, like the dream of the Declaration of Independence, you know, is that all of us are created equal, you know, even though, right, the Constitution is what helps us balance our powers, all for the sake of you know, what it means to be American. And then he goes on to say that in addition to our texts and our tradition teaching us social justice, we have been prepared for democracy by being persecuted everywhere. It trained us to be patient and to endure, right, and to sacrifice and to suffer. And that made us want righteousness even more, right? Because we would benefit from the world being a better place. So then he makes a leap. That's why I highlighted it. It says, indeed, loyalty to America demands rather that each American Jew become a Zionist. It's not just that these are like not inconsistent. It's not just that you can be an American patriot and a Zionist and there's no conflict, so fine. It's that being an American means you better be a Zionist. Yeah, he's not saying this. AIPAC will say this repeatedly, right? And many Jews since, right? That Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. We have to support it, right? Because it's in America's interest to have like a, this sort of like front, I forget what you call it in battle, right? Like the lead in on the battlefield, right? If we're trying to bring democracy to the Middle East, like Israel is the beginning of that. And it's not just about where we park our aircraft carriers, although they are parked, outside of Haifa and Herzliya. It's how are we going to show the rest of the world that America is the best, right? That our democracy is a light to the nations. We have to do it by supporting Israel. It comes from here, right? For only through the ennobling effect of its strivings can we develop the best that is in us and give this to this country the full benefit of our great inheritance. Like by helping Jews strive for a Zionist homeland, a place for Jews to live free, most from Europe, right? Makes us better Americans, and it will help America live out America's legacy. And so that in America, as elsewhere, the sons of the race may in future live lives and do deeds worthy of their ancestors. Good? Okay. So Brandeis argues that Americanness and Zionism are compatible. After last week, do you think so? I want to say this, they should be, right? I would like them to be. So the question is, where are they not? And as we said last week, we can sometimes feel like, number one, there's a version of Americanness that we saw at the insurrection on January 6th, where or at Charlottesville in 2016, right? The people want Jews to be out of America so that there's more room for them. There is that strain of a certain kind of, white supremacist Americanism that is not, for what it's worth, the majority. So, as long as we're not giving a lot of political credence to that, maybe we're okay. Hard to tell with QAnon and folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene getting elected to office. From the other side, we're going to look at, again, how identity politics today have made issues like pursuing social justice, particularly for people of color, when Louis Farrakhan and Nation of Islam are anti-Semitic, right? So can we, are we excluded from the advance of social justice because we're Zionist and certain people in that movement for social justice perceive Zionism to be, I guess bad, but there are other words for it, racist or colonialist or whatever else,
Yeah.
right? So do Americanism and Zionism still line up as compatible? Key thing for us to keep in mind at this point, why I said it's not a question mark, is that for the vast majority, the answer is yes, right? And again, you might align more on the right or more on the left in how you align those two, but they are compatible, except at the extremes, right? Again, right? Certain versions of the social justice movement and certain aspects of the ultra-right, right, white supremacy. But for this whole space in the middle, Americanism and Zionism generally are seen as compatible.
As long as you don't conflate either Americanness or Zionism with particular policies that are carried out by the
Yes.
two, political entities that are acting under those umbrellas.
Right, and that's that is, Neil, you're right on when I went out of my way to say that identity politics is about politics, that's exactly where it matters, is right. It's one thing when you're like with friends, or in today's world, like you're in your echo chamber of whatever media, right? You can get along or not get along or whatever, you can argue, right? But when it comes to actual policies being implemented, then we have like, then it becomes is it compatible or not? And actually, so our next thing is sort of, how does that actually play out, right? So is this, yes. So key thing to keep in mind in terms of dual loyalty is that, you know, however much, and we studied this some last time when we were looking at anti-Semitism with Danielle Hartman, we should be aware, right, that for the most part, the rabbinic tradition allows for pluralism, right? Hillel can say this and Shammai can say this, and you can even do what the minority opinion is, and you're still part of the Jewish community, right? Now, there are going to be some policies in which if you do like the minority opinion, I'm just going to tolerate that behavior, even though I don't just disagree with it, I think it's wrong, right? But it doesn't make you anathema. It doesn't make you deviant. If we can keep deviance out of our discourse, right, and stop writing off the right or the left from the other side, right, there are more Jews to hold. So one thing that Hartman is encouraging us to do, and Yehuda Kurtzer in particular, is to like not cast aspersions of dual loyalty on each other. We should not be doing this as Jews to other Jews. So like, you know, the degree to which many members of it, well, ultra-Orthodox, I know there are plenty of mainstream Jews who, you know, voted for Trump and all that kind of stuff, but the ultra-Orthodox communities voted more solidly for Trump. We should not say that they are no longer American because they've gone, you know, so far off on the Zionist bent or the Jewish bent or whatever, that, right? They've made Israel their single voter issue, right? The same way that no one should say to the left, like, you know, you're so consumed with Black Lives Matter that you're going to ignore anti-Semitism from various, you know, figures on the left, and from the March for Women, from the Women's March, or and their association with Linda Sarsour, or even, you know, some of the squad, right? Like, just, that doesn't make us un-American, and it doesn't make us not Zionist, right? So like, stop accusing us of not being able to have dual, like, stop accusing other Jews of not being able to balance their multiple loyalties such that Zionism and Americanism would be compatible. Don't throw someone out because they are balancing slightly different than you. That's what this slide is supposed to be about. And so just to kind of refine that point, in a partisan landscape, when it's clear that other political actors gain when they can claim the loyalties of the Jewish community on their side. So we're not only dealing with this like within our community, but others are using our debates to wedge between one part of the Jewish community and another. So we have to be clear when we enter into the debate about compatibility or incompatibility, if we're actually playing into one political argument, right, the right or the left. And when Jews become complicit in the rhetoric, we undermine our collective capacity to resist these arguments when it then gets turned against us, right? So like, again, if you actually fear anti-Semitism in very real ways, not just because of like a shooter in Pittsburgh, you know, who might or may not have been a lone wolf, but because you worry about anti-Semitism all the time, stop pointing fingers at other Jews, because, right, it's to various members of the right and the left in a politicized landscape to use our debates as a further wedge. The same thing then applies for other groups. Like, we should not accuse other groups of dual loyalty either, right? So this is that internal external issue of the accusation of dual loyalty. When it came from Pharaoh, it came from Haman. We knew what to do with it. When Napoleon offered us a way out, we were like, okay, we'll be French, and Jewish, like in our own space. And then Brandeis said, you know what, we're doing great here in America, and American values and Jewish values are parallel, and to be a good, right, that compatibility is actually demands us to pay attention to both, right? That was the Jews of France and Brandeis himself saying, we can do this internally. The degree to which it's become harder is the degree to which we need to be careful how we talk to each other. Questions so far? All right, we're going to go on to, so before we go on to identity politics, so Yehuda Kurtzer suggests that and we tried to do this a little bit, right, to think of Zionism slightly differently. We want to ensure that Zionism does not become a platform for pronouncing loyalty. Instead of saying like, you support Israel, you don't, you're pro or anti, like get that out of our Jewish language, our Jewish communal landscape, right? Because he says there are a lot of generative ways for diaspora Jews to belong to the project of the national homeland, right? Spiritual connections, activism, philanthropy, tourism, culture, religion. And we've seen all of them since before 48, right? Like the interest in agriculture, birthing Hebrew as a language, sending students on birthright, whether they, pray at the wall or take a Jewish name at Masada, or just eat a lot of falafel and maybe, have some sort of friendly encounter with an Israeli soldier on their bus and, develop some romance. Like all of that is good, right? And that is part of growing a connection between the diaspora and Israel. It is a kind of Zionism that's not about Netanyahu's policies, Trump's policies, Obama's policies, or anybody else, right? It's just about people. And again, if we make it about loyalty, then we're really making a mess of it. So, but he does note, right, that like, so if that's what American or diaspora Jews are going to be as Zionists, right, and it doesn't exclude lobbying Congress or, paying attention to certain aspects and wanting, the Iran deal to go one way or another, right? You can do that too. Just don't forget these other generative ways to be Zionist, right? There's still a boundary, which is to say, if you're a diaspora Jew, you're not an Israeli Jew. So diaspora Jews have to acknowledge that sometimes Israel is going to act in its own state interests. Nothing to do with Judaism, or maybe, but like mostly it has to do with Israel. Like, and it's like feeling that Iran is an existential threat, or that like, the difference between Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat is, I don't know what the difference is exactly, right? But like that has to be negotiated. You can't just pretend like, the Palestinian leadership is always the same, and that, just land for peace and that's the end of the story. You let Israel do its own thing, and those interests are going to often, right, conflict with the ideology and political interests of world Jewry. So,
Can you give an example of?
Can I give an example? So the one that comes to the press the most, right, is settlements in the West Bank, right? So the quote unquote status quo is supposed to be that the West Bank belongs to the Palestinian Authority, right? And Israel is providing a security zone, but the Palestinian Authority, and this is actually just like to be clear, right? This is why the thing about vaccinations is so fraught, right? Because Israel is providing like all of the kind of boundaries of infrastructure, but not the actual infrastructure. So Israel's not keeping vaccines from coming into the West Bank. It's actually offering vaccines to Palestinians who may like live in the West Bank, but it's up to the Palestinian Authority to distribute them. right? And so the degree to which, particularly Netanyahu's government, because he's been in power for like a really long time now, says that they're going to allow for Jews to expand settlements in the West Bank, to let more Jews build homes, build roads, and that the Israeli government, by the way, is going to use tax dollars to create the infrastructure and to protect those facts on the ground. That makes it harder for Jews around the world to argue in their home countries that Israel is not a colonial power, right? Because generally speaking, colonialism is bad, at least, for the last 3 decades, or maybe even more. And I mean, I personally believe that too, but like, I'm just saying, like, that's the argument. And so what is the UN going to spend its time on? It's going to spend its time on West Bank settlements and not on whatever's going on in China or whatever's going on in the Sudan, or right. Something just started happening in Ethiopia where there's a group of people who are being right. So like, I'm just saying, like, there are plenty of other places in the world where the United Nations could spend its concern about human rights, right? But every time Israel allows the building or extension of settlements or knocks down Palestinian homes, or in order to create a buffer zone, forget about actually like building settlements, it makes it harder for Jews around the world to say that Israel is a moral exemplar for the world. Now, for what it's worth, there is a very good argument for some of the settlements that have been in the West Bank since before 1967 being incorporated into the state of Israel. And that is for Israel and its neighbors to negotiate at a peace talk at some point, right? It's not, and this is what Yehuda Kurtz are saying, is like, I can't have that debate because it's not like, even if I care about it, I'm not an Israeli citizen, right? But I can tell you that when I'm on a college campus and Students for Justice in Palestine are holding an event, I'm going to end up arguing about these, quote, facts on the ground and policies in ways that make it harder for me to build bridges, or for me to just be comfortable as a Jew on campus, including running for student government. I'll be accused of being a Zionist and a racist because of it, even if I'm fully a left-wing, social justice Jew. Does that make sense? It was a great question,
Thank you.
Laura.
Thank you.
Okay. So now identity politics, because that's really like, where this gets complicated. Michal Biton is going to walk us through something. It's a clever frame. So I just want to make sure you understand the frame. She basically says that the Jewish approach to dual loyalty and to anti-Semitism and stuff like this is that Jewish identity and how we conduct ourselves in the political sphere has matched what other minorities were doing in the same time period in American history. Okay, so for the beginning of the 20th century, we were going to argue that equal rights, sorry, that should be rights plural, for all is good for the Jews, right? I'm going to pursue equal rights for everybody because it's going to have like a ancillary benefit to me. That's going to shift at a certain point in history to identity politics, to, again, my being Jewish makes me better at supporting Jews in the political sphere. And I'm going to kind of build up my Jewish identity and Jewish power. Okay, and then the question is, well, what about now when identity politics is just a little bit more complicated? So let's walk through her stuff. Going back to Emma Lazarus, she's even before the 20th century began, but like, she cared about her Judaism. Emma Lazarus was not the sort of like, oh, I'm an American poet. She's like, no, I'm solidly Jewish. I might be a little bit communist, but like, I'm fully also American. And when given the opportunity, she writes this poem, and it's about the Statue of Liberty. It ends up on the Statue of Liberty, and it doesn't say, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled Jews yearning to be free. Even though she was thinking about them, she knew about Eastern European Jews being persecuted, right? And wanting to come to America, the Golden Medina, right? She would have understood this. She's Sephardic, so it's like a little bit more, you know, she's attuned to that persecution story in ways that perhaps like Jews from France and Germany in particular who came to America in the 1800s and settled on the Upper East Side and made a lot of money, you know, the sort of like the Gimbles, the Macy's, the right, like Lord and Taylor, like those Jews, Neiman Marcus, right? Those Jews, they created our whole philanthropic like system to help Eastern European Jews who were coming in. She would have been familiar with their kind of like their understanding, right? But she would be more attuned to, again, this sense of persecution because of her Sephardic heritage. So she writes this poem, and it's about the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It's for everybody. It's not just for the Jews, right? But by the way, it'll be very good for the Jews. Fast forward to the civil rights movement. And I have to place this speech for you before maybe you look at the words. Look at the date. So it's the same day that Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. Rabbi Prince actually got to speak, like, I think somewhere like 2 to 5 people before King. And what does he say? This is just a selection. He says, when I was a rabbi in the Jewish community of Berlin under the Hitler regime, so he's going to draw on the Holocaust, I learned many things. And this is, by the way, a little bit surprising, but it goes to like an important message. The most important thing I learned under those circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and most tragic problem is silence. Okay, this is a survivor of the Shoah, is saying hatred and bigotry are not the worst things. Silence is. So what does he say? America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, the aspiration of America itself, right? What's good for the Blacks is good for all of us, right? And by the way, it's good for the Jews too, right? So, and this is what he learned in the Holocaust, is that, right, what would have been good for the Jews would have been good for all of humanity. It's very powerful, right? And it tells you a lot about the March on Washington, the degree to which it drew on a language of American nationalism and patriotism, American tropes, and not on, right, overthrowing America or how America was wrong, right? It was the undelivered promise, not, you know, the check that bounced, not on racism and bigotry and hatred. It was about, right, delivering the American promise. So what happens around the same time period, but when we look at the other piece of what was going on in the world and in American politics, which is like, for all we talk about MLK, most people talked about Malcolm and Martin, right? So Malcolm X and Black Power were also very powerful manifestations of articulating a minority view in the world. And Mark Dollinger recently published this book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, a lot of scandal around a new afterword. The publisher didn't want to like let Dollinger say certain things about the Black Lives Matter movement. And Dollinger wanted it in, like it's kind of like bringing it up to date from even just 2018. But regardless, just looking at the 1960s, you know, or looking back on the 1960s, Donald Feldstein was hired to do a report in 1970. And what does he say? It's no longer embarrassing or out to belong to a group on the college campus with the word Jew in the title. he noted literally scores of Jewish groups forming on college campuses across the country with aggressively Jewish missions that imitated the spirit, style, and tactics of the New Left and Black militants. Right? In the 1970s, it's not just Hillel on campus, it's the Jewish Zionists and the Jewish fraternities and the, like, in ways that were not true before. The Jewish social justice movement, the Jewish newspaper, the Jew, like, Jews come out of kind of hiding and become much more visible on campus. And not just on campus, but in the world and on the world stage. And in particular, this image happens to be from San Francisco, just because you have the Torah scrolls and the Let My People Go kind of very, you know, Passover Soviet Jewry rally. I'll try to make it a little larger. Oops, can I? I don't know if I can actually. It's not letting me zoom, sorry. But when I share it with you, you can kind of blow it up. But the one thing you can see is that it's really crowded, right? So this is San Francisco in 1983, right? I think it was 1986, the March on Washington, 200,000 Jews on 3 days notice, right? From all over the country, march on Washington in the spirit of glasnost and perestroika, right? But to let Jews in the Soviet Union be free to be Jewish, to emigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel, United States. It's something that you would not have seen prior to 1970. But the idea that again, being openly Jewish and in support of other Jews fit what it means to be American. This was us exercising our communal power on the political stage, basically lobbying the president, President Reagan, to like make a difference, and it worked. You know, like when Gorbachev came to visit, there were negotiations, and that's powerful. There's something else powerful that, by the way, happened around the same time period, which is not to be understated, which is that in 1968, forget about 1973 also, but you put both of them together, really starting in 68, Israel defending itself successfully in the Six-Day War. Jews experienced a level of pride and I don't know what else to call it besides pride, that expanded their sense of what it meant to be a Jew in the world, right? Instead of everything being about a backroom negotiation, suddenly it was okay to say you were Jewish, again, to found a group on campus, to fund Jewish things philanthropically, not just like a little pushka for JNF, but actually like political causes and support of Israel in different ways that also played into like the Soviet Jewry movement being a big moment. And by the way, Soviet Jewry is about human rights, right? So it's, you know, you have Israel defending itself and groups like AIPAC really taking off. They were founded, it was founded in 52, I think, but it's not until the 80s that it really starts to like accelerate its ability to lobby in Congress. And that's again, because of all these different things. So you have sort of typically right-wing stuff in terms of patriotism or nationalism, but also left-wing stuff like Soviet Jewry and freeing them to say like what it means to be Jewish. You have one other thing that's going on, which is kind of interesting because it's like a give and a take, which is in this time period, again, all leading up to 1990 when the culture, the conversation in the Jewish community changes in 1990. But in the 80s, the proliferation of Holocaust museums is astounding. The amount of money that starts to go into Holocaust education is it's extraordinary. And I will tell you, as someone who grew up in some of this time period, like I kind of bridge this a little bit. I experienced what Ephraim Buchwald talks about here. So he talks about how much money, and he says 168 million for the US Holocaust Museum in 1993. He mentions somewhere in here billions of dollars, over $500 million have already been pledged to or spent to build 19 Holocaust memorials and 36 research centers or libraries in America. Cities like Los Angeles have 2 or 3 competing Holocaust memorials. So what it means to be a Jew in this time period, what we're teaching our kids is to not give Hitler a posthumous victory, that Jews were victims and we don't want to be the victims anymore, right? Look, he says in the first 2 paragraphs, there's good justification, like it makes sense psychologically for this to be our concern and to be this to be where we spend our money. But what does that do to a young Jew? He says, it's quite likely that a young Jew today, this is in the highlight, knows who Hitler and Eichmann were, but has no idea of Rabbi Akiva and Maimonides. We've reached the absurd point where the only feature of Judaism with which our young Jews identify is that of a Jew as victim, murdered, cremated, or turned into a lampshade. Is there no joy in Jewish life? Is there no balm in Gilead? No wonder our young Jews are turned off and walking away from their heritage. I just want to say this because like I resisted it. Like I went on the March of the Living and like on Yom HaShoah, went from Auschwitz to Birkenau, and Elie Wiesel tried to speak and cried and couldn't finish his speech. It was very moving. And we went from there to Israel. I will tell you that the other half of this Holocaust identity is that Israel is the answer to everything. So when we talk about a loyalty test, I will tell you that I was kind of taught, right? If you don't want to be a Holocaust Jew, you are an Israeli Jew, right? Instead of being weak, you're strong. And in fact, Yad Vashem in the 90s was designed that way. It was redesigned in the aughts, like in the early 2000s. It was redesigned to kind of remove that narrative, okay? But it really was like, you know, European Jews went to the slaughter, and Israeli Jews and Zionist Jews are strong and rebuilt the Jew from the inside, which makes it, here's your choice, victim or powerful, right? Let me just see what the next text is before I take questions. I might skip this one, which I kind of thought I would. All right, so questions, comments, and if we have time, I'll go back to Baldwin. Sid, it looked like you were going to say something.
No.
Okay. So, what?
I just I was thinking. I mean, I'd heard that when Israel was founded, that was part of the idea that we don't want to be these, being led to the slaughter.
Right.
And one of the reasons, I guess, why the Sephardic pronunciation is adopted. We don't want to be the East European Jews who just march into the gas chambers.
Right. No, and that was, again, predating the state of Israel. There was a version of Zionism, which is like to create the new Jew, right? And the writings are, I think it's A.D. Gordon who articulated a lot of it, but also Jabotinsky. It was very real and made a lot of sense. But to see it like created it as educational models, and by the way, to have experienced it myself, it was very profound and thoroughgoing. And it makes me, when I hear these loyalty issues, like see how easy it is to slip into that language. So the question, I'm reminding us of the question of compatibility of Americanness and Zionism today. So look, in a time in which Malcolm X was expressing Black power and other minority groups were starting to kind of like express their identities in the multiculturalism of the era, right? So like late 80s, early 90s, it was all about multiculturalism. And that's where you get into globalism, right? We were becoming more cosmopolitan. It was less about a melting pot and more about like my identity and your identity. We're together, we make the perfect tossed salad. That was like the new image. Instead of the melting pot, it's a tossed salad, right? Yeah, okay. So in that environment for the Jews to like be more active on campus, out in the open and making change and doing all kinds of things, right and left, for us to pursue human rights, especially for Soviet Jews, right? Made a lot of sense. By the way, Jonathan Pollard being a kind of example of the opposite, where he demonstrated dual loyalty, right? He was more loyal to Israel than to the United States. He said he had good reasons. He wanted more intelligence sharing, but like it was a shanda for the Jews, like we say it was bad for the Jews, also in this time period, right? And that was how the Jewish press covered it, right? Very much as like, well, he did exactly what we weren't supposed to do, right? Which was like overstate our allegiance or our kind of loyalty to Israel. Holocaust museums, Israel is a kind of image of an exemplar fighting anti-Semitism, not just the ADL, but even more, like particularly in the wake of the first Intifada in the early 90s, what it meant to like write letters to the editor, to call out anti-Zionist iconography and messaging. All of that was part of this period. So it made sense that like, you know, we were more active in Congress and in the media and everywhere else that we could be. And it worked, right? It worked. Joe Lieberman was the, you know, the vice presidential nominee alongside Al Gore. And that was like the pinnacle of Jews arriving back, you know, in 2000, right? You know, obviously the dynamic has changed, but like that was where we were. So just a nuance here. Michal Biton wants to bring us back to the present in a slightly different way. And I know I'm a little bit short on time, so I'm going to try to do this in a way that allows for discussion. She is a Sephardic Latina, so she's from Argentina. And by the way, it's important. I think I put it in the ellipses here. I did, down here at the bottom, these ellipses. She's going to say that she had friends whose families were killed in the AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires, right? So she experienced like lethal Jew hatred, going back to last week, acutely. So for her, when it came to the Women's March and whether or not she was going to participate, right, she felt acutely as a Sephardic Latina Jew that she could not march. What did she say about it though? She said a few things. First of all, she's just bringing us up to date in the first paragraph, just to say that like it was clear that members of the organization or the people who were organizing the march, like Tamika Mallory and others, right, had ties to Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan in particular, and had expressed anti-Semitic sentiments, not just Farrakhan, but they themselves, and that was problematic. So the question was, should Jews participate in the Women's March? Right, this is 2016. This is supposed to be like the day after Trump is inaugurated, right? And what she ends up saying is that Yavila McCoy, who by the way is a Black Jew, okay, founder of Ayeka, she was added to the steering committee, okay? And she says McCoy and others have been urging Jewish representation in next week's march, specifically highlighting the voices and experiences of Jewish women of color in the contingency. So like, okay, if you're just coming because women and you're white women, like, and this is hard for you, I guess it's okay to stay home, but if you are a woman of color, we need you, right? And by the way, if you want to support women, Jewish women of color, you got to show up. And she did this, McCoy does this, right, in a nuanced and thoughtful statement, which clearly outlines why many Jewish women of color are committed to the Women's March. So Biton is not saying no one should go. She's saying, she's going to end up saying why she can't, right? So Tamika Mallory should be there. People who want to support her should be there. It's the right thing. And she says one of the things that they say in that release is, as Jewish women of color who live at the intersection of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and who are committed to standing against white supremacy, patriarchy, and religious oppression in all its forms, we will play an integral role in the healing and unification of our communities and in the work of securing greater justice and freedom for us all, right? That's their petition to the organizers of the march and to other people to come. And she respects them. I read this statement with respect for the experiences that led the authors to write it. And you might expect her to feel the same way, but she doesn't, okay? So she's gonna abstain, and why? My identity, which otherwise fits in with the intersectional fight for common liberation and for women's rights, informs my refusal to participate in a movement led by individuals who have contributed to the normalization of anti-Semitic discourse and who have yet, despite recent apologies, to regain the trust of many in the Jewish community. So she's saying it's not like these people who have anti-Semitic sentiments haven't apologized. It's just like, I don't trust them enough. And by the way, in the same way that McCoy is saying that her identity like demands for her to be there, the same way Brandeis said being, Zionist or being American demands us to be Zionist, her identity informs her refusal, right? There are feminist Jews, Jewish women, color, Hispanic, immigrants, Mizrahi, Sephardic, Jews of Arab lands, right? Who are making a conscious choice to not join, right? And it's informed by their experience of vulnerability. She says at the end in the highlight, I write this then to challenge the dichotomy that has already begun to emerge, a dichotomy that posits an either or worldview in which individuals who refuse to march in this particular women's movement are portrayed as not caring for social or racial justice. She's saying, I'm going to, in this particular instance, use my identity to say I don't belong at this particular moment, but it doesn't mean I don't want to be in dialogue. It doesn't mean I don't want, women or women of color or people of color to advance in civil rights, right? It's just that, her particular concerns outweigh participation. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's a new, not new, it's like the contemporary Jewish version, and it's all the more poignant because of all of her identities, right, of what we call identity politics today and intersectionality. And I will tell you that in the interview piece after her lecture, Michal Biton interviews Alana Stein-Hain, who is a modern Orthodox, she would be a rabbi, she's a PhD, so, but she's served as a paraclergy in Lincoln Square Synagogue at some point, for whom like her Judaism comes first, and being a woman is colored by that. And so there's that piece, but she also interviews Rachel Timmener, who's a rabbi, who's lesbian, white, right? And owns all of those identities in ways that she says, like, my lesbianism is informed by my feminism, and my feminism is informed by my Judaism, but my lesbianism is also informed by my Judaism. They all have a voice in each other's pieces, right? And in any given case, it will mean that she's going to, when it comes to, Neil, to your point, to a political decision, yes to march or no, not to march, yes to sit down with Tamika Mallory or not to, right? She has to weigh all those identities. And so like, I'll recommend that piece of the videos to you. So the last thing, I want to go back to this, like, what demands what of you? So, right, what did Brandeis say before? And I changed the highlights here. At the bottom paragraph, he said, indeed, loyalty to America demands rather that each American Jew become a Zionist. But if you look at other pieces of what he says, the Jewish spirit, this at the end, so long preserved, the character developed by so many centuries of sacrifice should be preserved and developed further. So he's recognizing, like, where we come from actually matters, and the stories we tell. And like, again, broader than the Holocaust, but including the Holocaust, like all of our experiences, so that in America as elsewhere, the sons of the race may in future live lives and do deeds worthy of our ancestors. He's saying, like, we have to take our identities and stand for them. We have to take action. And the question is going to be, right, can we act like Brandeis and say that our Zionism or Judaism and our American patriotism are completely compatible? And by the way, that might put us on the right, that might put us on the left, right? But for what it's worth, there's a right and a left in America. Or are we going to do like Biton, and we're going to like say, like, okay, our particular identity, right, which, by the way, includes all the other identities that Brandeis mentioned, is going to make it so that, one time we're going to be this way, and another time we're going to be that way, right? But we need to be in dialogue with all of this. So it's not necessarily about acting all the time, but it's about being in dialogue and taking action where appropriate. Or, as I leave the question mark, is it something else? What do you think? Do we have to keep looking for a new solution?
I guess Biton is saying, it's situational, it seems, for her.
Yes.
I don't know how it could be anything else. I mean, you can try to come up with some hard and fast position, for all time, but that doesn't work usually.
Right. And the one nuance I want to add to that, because you remember a long time ago, we were looking at nationalism and is it conditional? So like, when the Jewish people are in danger, we're going to tip like the particular versus the universal, right? We might change which way the scale bends, right? For her, she says like what actually matters here is that like it might change in every situation, but it has to be rooted in your identity, right? It has to be rooted in the experience of, and it might be just like, again, you as opposed to a group, or maybe your group is small, right? And it's part of a larger group. So there are gonna be times when you go with the larger, and there are gonna be times when your smaller piece pulls you away from that. Neil or Sue or anybody else, questions?
And, as Sid said, a lot of this is just situational, and you have to use your own judgment on what the level of danger, the level of why something calls for this kind of approach rather than the other, and make up your own mind.
I agree with what Neil is saying, that I think it's all encompassing, and then we need to speak out with whatever is occurring at the time. I mean, I'm an American, I'm a Jew. Israel needs to survive. It makes me a Zionist. I visited Israel, can't wait to come back. I work at Hillel, whatever. So I think they should be, and they are incompatible to me. And as each one occurs, that's when I will speak out in its defense.
I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if I can, like with our like less than any time remaining, I want to say that like I think you're all right, and I want to make sure you're not missing the crucial piece that the Hartman Institute is trying to get us to add, which is that Brandeis and Beton, each in their own way, added the experience of our people and our tradition. So going back to like Ephraim Buchwald, it cannot be that we're just doing this out of, acting against Farrakhan or calling out, any particular policy of any of the U.S. presidents, right, or their administrations. It has to be rooted in text or in our sources or in our tradition, right? So Jeremiah and Ezra and the other pieces that we looked at, right? The grounding has to be like Rabbi Akiva and Maimonides, in addition to any sort of one single piece of history or one moment in time. And the more we engage in our text or speak the language of being grounded in that tradition, then the more likely it is that we will respect each of you for the decisions you make and anybody else in the American Jewish community for the decisions they make, right? And it's that respect that we have to kind of work at rebuilding. We want to be respected for our opinions. And I think that, like, again, if you don't have to quote Jeremiah in a conversation with someone who disagrees with you about like what it means to be American or what it means to be Jewish, but if you have as a reference point that somebody is living out, right, a very particular piece of our Jewish tradition in terms of where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, then you're going to give them a lot more room to like say things you disagree with. The realm in which, when last week we talked about deviance, there's tolerable, intolerable deviance. You're going to treat them more as a tolerable deviant, and maybe even shift to tolerating them if you can, right, build that level of respect. And it starts, I think, by modeling, being engaged in the conversation ourselves. And so I'm really glad that you're here with me. Just to wrap up, when Sarah sends you these slides, it'll recommend the interview at the end of Unit 11, and I will include, it's not the Identity Crisis podcast out of the Hartman Institute, it's their other, like, Faith in Something out of their Israel office. Danielle Hartman, Alana Stein-Hain, and Yossi Klein Halevi discuss Michael Che's joke on SNL. I gave you a Times of Israel piece, I think it was, in the email last week about the joke, but there's a further exploration if you want to keep going with like, maybe that's not our biggest concern. That's sort of the point of the podcast. But it doesn't mean we're not concerned, just how we handle it. And I'll see you guys next week.
Good.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Thank you.
shalom. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Yeah. And stop sharing. I need to move this.
I'm not a